The long hallways of the colony ship New Hope hummed with the sound of machinery. The ship was huge, like a small city floating through space. It carried 10,000 people to their new home, a planet called Kepler 438 bits. They had been traveling for 3 years already. 5 more years to go. Li Jin pushed his cleaning cart down the white corridor of Level 7. His dark hands were strong but gentle as he worked. At 58 years old, his hair was sprinkled with gray and lines marked his face. But his eyes were sharp and missed nothing. He wore the simple blue uniform of the maintenance crew. As he mopped the floor near the agricultural department, he heard the familiar sound of quick, sharp footsteps. His shoulders tensed slightly. He knew those footsteps. Kim Sun, head administrator of the agricultural department, walked briskly toward her office. She was 50 years old with perfect black hair pulled into a tight bun. Her uniform was spotless, and she carried a tablet in her hand. She saw Li and frowned. "You're still working on this section. It's been an hour already," she said coldly. Li kept his face calm. "Yes, Mom. There was a spill in Section 6. I had to clean that first." Kim made a small noise of disapproval. "Well, make sure you finish before the department meeting. I don't want you disturbing important work." "Yes, Ma'am," Li said quietly. As Kim walked away, Li heard her mutter, "Can't even clean a floor quickly. Why did they let people like him on this mission?" Li continued mopping as if he hadn't heard. He was used to Kim's comments. Many people on the ship respected everyone equally. But some, like Kim, brought old Earth prejudices with them to the stars. Later that day, Li cleaned the observation deck. This was his favorite place on the ship. The giant windows showed the endless blackness of space, filled with countless stars. He often came here during breaks, just to look at the stars and think. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said a voice. Li turned to see Park Han, the ship's executive officer. Park was tall and lean, with kind eyes that missed very little. "Yes, sir," Li replied. "Never gets old." Park smiled. "How long have we known each other, Li?" 15 years. "I think you can call me Han by now." Li smiled back. Old habits stir, hard to break. They stood in comfortable silence, looking at the stars. Park and Li had served together in the Earth Defense Force decades ago, before Park moved up the ranks and Li retired. Now Park was second in command of the entire colony mission. Few people on the ship knew about their shared past. Li preferred it that way. "How are you finding civilian life these days?" Park asked quietly. Li continued cleaning. "Peaceful, simple, just how I wanted it." "And the other staff? They treat you well?" Li paused for a moment. "Most do." Park nodded, understanding what wasn't said. "Kim's son giving you trouble again?" "Nothing I can't handle," Li said. "She's just from a different time. Her attitude is from a different century," Park said with a frown. "I could speak to her." Li shook his head firmly. "No. I chose this job because I wanted no attention, no special treatment. I'm just a janitor here. That's all I want to be." After years of commanding troops in battle, making life or death decisions, and carrying the heavy weight of leadership, Li had chosen the simplest job he could find on the colony mission. He found peace in creating cleanliness and order. No one died if he made a mistake mopping a floor. Park respected his wish but didn't like it. "One day, she'll learn who you really are." Li smiled. "Let's hope not." In the agricultural department, Kim Sun ran her team with strict efficiency. The department was crucial to the colony mission. They maintained the ship's food production and were developing crops that would grow on their new planet. The latest tests on the modified rice show promising results, reported Baijun, one of her researchers. "It should adapt well to the soil samples we have from Kepler 438 bits." Kim nodded with approval. "Good. And the protein cultures?" Another scientist began to answer when the lights flickered. Everyone paused and looked up. "Third time this week," Kim muttered. Engineering can't seem to fix anything properly. The meeting continued, but Kim was annoyed. These technical problems were becoming more common. Small issues, but irritating. The lights, temperature changes, minor system glitches. Nothing serious, but a ship like New Hope should run perfectly. After the meeting, Kim walked to her office and found Lee Jin cleaning the windows. "I thought I told you to finish before our meeting," she said sharply. Lee turned calmly. "The meeting ended early, ma'am. I thought it would be a good time to clean the offices while they're empty." "Well, you can't clean mine now. I have work to do," she said, walking past him into her office. Lee nodded and moved his cart down the hall. As he cleaned, he noticed something odd. The temperature control panel was showing strange readings. The numbers fluctuated slightly, then returned to normal. Most people wouldn't notice, but Lee had seen similar patterns in other systems throughout the ship. Something wasn't right. That evening, in the cafeteria, Lee sat alone eating dinner. The large room was filled with colony members from all departments. Lee watched them as he ate. Scientists, engineers, medical staff, teachers, farmers, all the skills needed to build a new world. Kim Sun entered with 2 other administrators. She got her food and sat at a table with people from her department. Lee noticed how others responded to her, with respect for her position, but little warmth. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, longer this time. The cafeteria went dark for 3 seconds before the backup systems kicked in. People murmured nervously. The ship's communication system crackled to life. "All passengers, this is Captain Choi. We are experiencing minor power fluctuations. Engineering is addressing the issue. There is no cause for concern. Please continue your activities as normal." The message was calm and reassuring. Most people relaxed and returned to their meals, but Lee noticed Captain Choi's choice of words: passengers, not crew members. The captain was downplaying the situation. Lee finished his meal quickly and left the cafeteria. Instead of returning to his quarters, he walked to a maintenance access point and slipped inside. Using his worker's keycard, he accessed a terminal that showed ship systems. To most, it would display only basic information, but Lee entered a series of commands that Park had quietly given him access to. The screen changed, showing more detailed system information. Lee studied it carefully. Power levels were fluctuating across multiple systems. Environmental controls showed unexplained temperature variations. Communications had brief moments of static. Each problem was small. Together, they made a pattern. Lee pulled up external sensor data. Most readings were normal, but there was a tiny anomaly on the port side of the ship. A small temperature increase on the outer hull, just a few degrees. It could be nothing, or it could be something attaching itself to their ship. Lee's military instincts, dormant for years, began to wake up. He downloaded the data to his personal tablet and closed the terminal. He needed to talk to Park. The next morning, Lee was cleaning the main corridor when alarms suddenly blared throughout the ship. Red lights flashed in the hallways. "All crew members report to emergency stations. This is not a drill. Repeat, all crew members report to emergency stations." People rushed through the corridors, some looking scared, others determined. Lee moved to the side, watching. He knew what was happening before anyone announced it. His tablet had pinged an hour earlier with a message from Park. "You were right." Something had attached itself to their ship. Something not from Earth. Lee continued cleaning, moving slowly toward the agricultural department. Emergency protocols didn't specify where maintenance staff should go, which gave him freedom to move around. He wanted to be near Section 7, where the ship's hull showed that temperature anomaly. As he pushed his cart around the corner, he saw Kim Sun rushing toward the agriculture emergency meeting room. She looked stressed but composed, barking orders into her communicator. When she saw Lee, her eyes narrowed. "What are you doing here?" "Maintenance should be in lower deck C." Lee answered calmly. "Just making sure the corridors stay clear, ma'am." "We don't need clean floors during an emergency," she snapped. "Go where you're supposed to be, now." Lee nodded respectfully and turned his cart around. But instead of heading to lower deck C, he took a service elevator to level 8, just above the anomaly on the hull. He needed to see for himself what was out there. And if his suspicions were correct, the colony ship New Hope would soon need more than just a janitor. It would need the man Lee used to be. The emergency lights bathed the corridors in red. People rushed to their stations while the ship's computer repeated its warning. "All crew members report to emergency stations. This is not a drill." Lee Jin moved quickly through the service tunnels of the ship. These narrow passages were used by maintenance workers to access difficult areas. Most passengers never saw these tunnels, but Lee knew every inch of them. He reached a small hatch and pressed his hand against a scanner. The door slid open, revealing a small room filled with screens and equipment. This was a maintenance monitoring station for the ship's outer hull. Lee sat down at the console and entered his code. The screen lit up, showing the outside of the ship. Lee zoomed in on the area where he had detected the temperature change. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then he adjusted the sensors. There it was, a small object about the size of a car, attached to the hull. It was dark gray and seemed to blend with the ship's surface. If you weren't looking for it, you might miss it completely. Lee studied it carefully. The object had no markings or lights. It wasn't a piece of space debris. Its surface was too smooth, its attachment too precise. This was something made by intelligent beings, something not human. His tablet beeped with a message from Park. "Emergency meeting in Ag Department. Come now." Lee frowned. Why the Agricultural Department? Then he understood. It was the closest secure meeting room to the object's location. He quickly left the monitoring station and headed toward the meeting. In the Agricultural Department's conference room, Kim Sun was not happy. The room was filled with senior staff from different departments. Captain Choi stood at the front with a serious expression. Next to him was Park Han, looking grim. "Why are we meeting here instead of the main command center?" Kim asked. "My department is trying to secure the food production systems." Captain Choi, a stern man in his 60s, answered calmly. "This room is closest to the area of concern. We need to keep this meeting small and quiet for now." The door opened, and Lee Jin walked in, still wearing his janitor uniform. Kim stood up immediately. "What is he doing here?" "This is for essential personnel only. Go sweep somewhere else." The room fell silent. People looked uncomfortable. Some looked at the floor. Others glanced at Captain Choi, waiting for his response. But it was Park Han who spoke. "Administrator Kim, I called Mr. Lee to this meeting specifically." Kim's face showed confusion. "The janitor? Why would you?" "Colonel Lee Jin," Park said firmly, "is not just a janitor." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. People straightened in their chairs. Some looked at Lee with new interest. "Colonel," Kim repeated, her voice suddenly uncertain. Park nodded. "Retired Colonel Lee Jin, former commander of Earth Defense Forces 7th Tactical Response Division, expert in first contact scenarios and alien technology." Kim's mouth opened, but no words came out. She slowly sat back down. Lee remained standing by the door, his face calm as always. "Sir, I'd prefer we focus on the current situation rather than my past." Captain Choi nodded. "Agreed. Everyone, we have a serious problem. An unidentified object has attached itself to our ship. It appears to be some kind of probe or device, and it's affecting our systems." The captain turned to a screen showing the object on the hull. "It's interfacing with our technology somehow. We're seeing increasing system failures. Power fluctuations are getting worse. Communications are degrading. Life support is still stable, but we're seeing small issues there too." One of the engineering officers spoke up. "We've tried to analyze it, but our instruments can't penetrate its surface. We can't tell what it's made of or how it works." Captain Choi looked at Lee. "Colonel, Park tells me you noticed this before our sensors did. What are your thoughts? All eyes turned to Lee. He walked to the front of the room, looking at the screen. The device is artificial and highly advanced, Lee said. It's not attacking us directly, but it's studying our systems, learning how our ship works. How can you know that? Asked Kim, her voice challenging despite her shock. Lee pointed to different parts of the screen. Look at these connection points. They're positioned over key system junctions. The way it's integrating with our hull suggests it's designed to analyze new technology it encounters. He turned to face the room. I've seen similar approaches during first contact scenarios with the Centauri Coalition and during the Proxima incident. People murmured. The Proxima incident was a famous first contact situation from 20 years ago. It had almost led to war. So what is it? Asked the chief engineer. Some kind of scout. A weapon. I believe it's an automated probe, Lee said, designed to evaluate potential threats. It's trying to determine if we're dangerous. Are you saying aliens sent this? Kim asked, her voice smaller now. Lee nodded. Yes, and how we respond will determine what happens next. Captain Choi took control of the meeting again. Based on Colonel Lee's assessment, we need to form a response team immediately. We need to either remove this device or communicate with it somehow. The ship suddenly shuddered. The lights flickered and went out completely for 5 seconds before emergency power kicked in. The probe is going deeper into our systems, Lee said. We don't have much time. Captain Choi quickly assigned tasks. Engineering, work on isolating critical systems. Security, prepare for any scenario. Medical, be ready for casualties if systems fail. He turned to Kim. Administrator Kim, your department needs to secure food production in case life support is compromised. Then he looked at Lee. Colonel, I want you to lead the technical response team. Find a way to communicate with this thing or remove it. Kim stood up again, her face pale but determined. Captain, with all due respect, we can't just put a janitor in charge of this crisis, regardless of his past. The room went silent again. Harkan looked like he might say something angry, but Lee raised his hand slightly. Administrator Kim, Lee said calmly, I understand your concern, but right now we need everyone's skills. I spent 15 years studying alien technology and communication methods. I led the team that established first contact protocols for Earth. He looked directly at her. And for the past 3 years, I've cleaned every inch of this ship. I know its systems and access points better than almost anyone. Both skills are useful right now. Before Kim could respond, the ship shook violently. Alarms blared. The captain's communicator beeped urgently. Sir, came a panicked voice. The environmental systems on Deck 5 have failed completely. Oxygen levels are dropping. That's the residential deck, gasped one of the officers. There are families there. Captain Choi made his decision. Colonel Lee, take whatever personnel you need. Solve this problem. The rest of you, to your emergency stations. As people rushed from the room, Kim Sun remained seated, staring at Lee Jin. The man she had treated like dirt for 3 years was now in charge of saving the ship. Lee approached her. Administrator Kim, I need your help. The agricultural department has the most advanced biological sensors on the ship. We might need them to understand how this probe communicates. Kim looked up at him, her face showing confusion, shame, and fear all at once. Why would you want my help after how I treated you? Lee's expression remained professional. Because you're good at your job. And right now, everyone's skills matter more than personal feelings. He held out his hand to her. Will you help us? After a moment of hesitation, Kim took his hand and stood up. Yes. Together, they hurried from the room as the ship's alarms continued to sound. The probe was taking over more systems. The threat was growing. And the retired soldier was back in command, whether he wanted to be or not. Lee Jin moved quickly through the corridors, with Kim Sun struggling to keep up. Emergency lights flashed around them. The ship shook again. People ran in different directions, some scared, others trying to help. "Where are we going?" Kim asked, her voice shaky but determined. "Maintenance access point 7B, Lee replied. "It's directly below where the probe attached itself." They reached a narrow doorway that Kim had passed 100 times but never noticed. Lee swiped his card, and the door opened to reveal a small room filled with tools and equipment. "This is a maintenance hub," Lee explained. "From here, we can access the ship's inner hull." 4 other crew members joined them. Chief Engineer Song, Security Officer Yoon, Communications Specialist Cho, and Medical Officer Kang. They all looked at Lee with respect, waiting for instructions. Kim felt strange. Just yesterday, she had been ordering this man around, treating him like he was beneath her. Now everyone was looking to him for leadership. Lee wasted no time. "The alien probe is connecting to multiple ship systems. Our first priority is to isolate life support to prevent further failures." He turned to the engineer. "Song, can you create a separate power circuit for essential systems?" Song nodded. "Yes, Colonel, but it will take at least an hour." "You have 30 minutes, Lee said firmly. "Work with Officer Yoon for security access." As they left, Lee turned to the communications specialist. "Joe, I need you to set up monitoring equipment. We need to understand how this thing is communicating with our systems." Kim watched as Lee gave clear, confident orders. This was not the quiet janitor she thought she knew. This was a commander who expected to be obeyed. "What do you need from me?" she asked when the others had their assignments. Lee looked at her directly. "I need your knowledge of the ship's biological interfaces. The agricultural department uses biosensors to monitor crop growth. Those sensors might help us understand the probe's technology." Kim nodded, still trying to process everything. "We have advanced biopattern recognition systems. They might be useful." "Good. Let's." A violent explosion rocked the ship, cutting Lee off mid-sentence. The lights went out completely. Emergency alarms blared. "That came from near the agricultural department," Kim said, her eyes wide with fear. Lee grabbed a toolkit and emergency lights. "Let's go." When they reached the agricultural department, smoke filled the corridor. Sparks flew from damaged equipment. Several people lay on the floor, injured from the explosion. Medical Officer Kang immediately began helping the wounded. Lee moved toward the source of the damage, a large control panel that had exploded outward. "What happened?" Lee asked one of the agricultural technicians. "System overload," the young man coughed. The environmental controls suddenly spiked. The panel couldn't handle it. Lee examined the damaged panel. "The probe is trying to access the environmental control systems. It's overloading our technology because it doesn't understand its limitations." Kim walked up behind him, looking worried. "Most of our food production requires precise environmental control. If those systems fail completely, we could lose our crops." Lee nodded grimly. "We need to isolate the agricultural systems from the main ship's network." They worked quickly, disconnecting critical systems and setting up temporary controls. Kim directed her staff while Lee handled the technical aspects. Despite the circumstances, they worked well together. "Hand me that sealing compound," Lee said, pointing to a tube on a nearby table. Kim reached for it. But at that moment, another smaller explosion erupted from an adjacent panel. Sparks and metal fragments flew through the air, heading straight toward Kim. Without hesitation, Lee pushed her out of the way. The debris hit him instead, slicing into his shoulder and side. He fell to the ground with a grunt of pain. "Lee!" Kim cried out, rushing to his side. "Someone help. He's hurt." Medical Officer Kang hurried over and examined Lee's wounds. "These are deep, but not life-threatening. We need to get him to medical." Lee shook his head, trying to stand. "No time. We need to finish isolating the systems." "You need medical attention," Kim insisted, surprised at how worried she felt. Lee looked at her, his eyes steady despite the pain. "The ship comes first, always." Kim recognized something in his eyes then, the look of someone who had always put duty before personal safety. How had she never seen it before? "At least let Kang patch you up here," she said firmly. "I'll continue with the isolation procedure." Lee nodded, allowing Kang to treat his wounds while Kim took over the technical work. She followed Lee's instructions, connecting bypass circuits and rerouting power. Her hands shook at first, but soon steadied as she focused on the task. 20 minutes later, they had successfully isolated the agricultural systems. The environmental controls stabilized. "Good work," Lee said, now standing with his shoulder and side bandage. He moved stiffly, but insisted he could continue. Kim looked at him with new eyes. "Why did you do that?" "Push me out of the way." Lee seemed surprised by the question. "It's what anyone would do." "No," Kim said quietly. "It's not what anyone would do. Especially not for someone who treated them like I treated you." Before Lee could respond, their communicators beeped. It was Captain Choi. "Colonel Lee, we have a new problem. The probe is attempting to access our navigation systems. If it succeeds, we could lose control of the ship completely." "We're on our way," Lee replied, already moving toward the door despite his injuries. In the ship's secondary command center, Captain Choi, Park Han, and several other officers were monitoring the situation. Screens showed the ship's systems, many flashing red with warnings. "The probe has already accessed 40% of our navigation controls," the navigation officer reported. "At this rate, we'll lose control within the hour." Lee studied the screens carefully. "It's not trying to control the ship," he said after a moment. "It's analyzing our technology, learning how we navigate." "Learning for what purpose?" Captain Choi asked. "To determine if we're a threat," Lee explained. "This probe was likely left as a sentinel by an advanced species. It attaches to passing ships, learns about their technology, and reports back to its creators." "So it's like an automated security system?" asked Park. "Exactly," Lee nodded. "The problem is, our technology is incompatible with its methods of analysis. That's causing the system failures." Kim had been listening carefully. Something clicked in her mind. "It's like when we try to grow earth plants in alien soil samples. The chemical incompatibility causes the plants to die." Lee looked at her with approval. "That's a good analogy." Kim felt a small surge of pride at his words, then immediately felt foolish for it. Yesterday, she would have dismissed any comparison from a janitor. Now she valued his opinion. What had changed? Not him. Just her perception of him. "If it's just gathering information," Kim said slowly, "could we give it what it wants in a controlled way? Instead of letting it take information, we could provide it." Lee's eyes lit up. "That's it. We need to communicate with it on its terms. Show it we're not a threat." "How do we do that?" Captain Choi asked. Lee's face grew serious. "Someone needs to go outside. Make direct contact with the probe." The room fell silent. "That's extremely dangerous," Park said. "The probe could interpret it as an attack." "It's a risk we have to take," Lee replied. "And I should be the one to go." Kim looked at him in alarm. "You're injured. You can't go outside in your condition." "I have the most experience with alien technology," Lee said firmly. "It has to be me." As they argued, the ship shuddered again. More alarms sounded. "Life support is failing on Deck 3, someone reported. Oxygen levels dropping." Captain Choi made the decision. "Prepare for EVA. Colonel Lee will make contact with the probe." As the others rushed to prepare, Kim stayed behind with Lee. "Why did you choose to be a janitor?" she asked suddenly. "You could have had any position on this ship with your background." Lee was quiet for a moment before answering. "After 20 years of war and difficult decisions, I wanted peace. I wanted to create order without the weight of command. No one dies if I make a mistake mopping a floor." Kim felt shame wash over her. All this time, she had judged him based on his job, his appearance. Never once had she considered his story, his choices. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Lee looked at her with understanding in his eyes. "We all have things to learn on this journey." Together, they headed to prepare for what might be the most dangerous spacewalk in human history. The airlock room was busy with activity. Technicians prepared the spacesuit while medical staff checked Lee's injuries one last time. His bandages had been replaced, but everyone knew he was in no condition for a spacewalk. Captain Choi stood with Park Han, reviewing the plan. Once outside, you'll have 20 minutes of oxygen. The safety line will keep you connected to the ship. Lee nodded as a technician helped him into the heavy spacesuit. His face showed pain with each movement, though he tried to hide it. Kim Sun watched from the side, her mind racing. She had spent the last hour studying the alien probe's patterns. Something about them seemed familiar to her. As an agricultural specialist, she had worked with many biological systems that communicated through patterns rather than language. "Wait," she said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. "I've been analyzing the probe's communication patterns," Kim explained, stepping forward. "They're similar to the biorhythmic patterns we use in our plant growth chambers. I think I can communicate with it." Lee looked at her with interest. "Go on." Kim pulled up data on her tablet. "Look at these patterns. The probe sends signals in groups of 3, with pauses between each group. This is exactly how we program our biorhythmic stimulators for plant growth." She showed them more data. "I believe I can configure a simple communication device to send response patterns. Tell it we're not a threat." "That's a good theory," Lee said, "but someone still needs to attach the device to the probe. It requires direct contact." "I'll do it," Kim said firmly. The room fell silent. Captain Choi frowned. "Administrator Kim, you have no spacewalk training." "But I understand the communication patterns," she insisted. "And Colonel Lee is injured. He shouldn't be doing this." Lee studied her face. "It's dangerous." "I know," Kim replied. "But you risked your life to save me earlier. Now it's my turn." After a long moment, Lee nodded. "I can guide her through the process. Talk her through each step from here." Captain Choi considered this, then finally agreed. "Get Administrator Kim suited up." 15 minutes later, Kim stood in the airlock wearing a spacesuit. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had never been outside the ship before. Through her helmet, she looked at Lee, who was now seated at a communication station. "Remember," he said calmly, "move slowly. The safety line will keep you connected to the ship. I'll be talking to you the whole time." Kim nodded, trying to control her fear. "I'm ready." The inner door closed. Air hissed as it was removed from the chamber. Then the outer door opened, revealing the endless blackness of space. Kim took a deep breath and pushed herself forward, out into the void. She felt weightless, floating above the massive hull of the ship. Stars surrounded her, countless points of light against perfect darkness. "I'm outside," she said, her voice shaky. "You're doing fine." Lee's steady voice came through her helmet. "Use your suit thrusters gently. Aim toward the port side. The probe is located 50 meters from your position." Kim carefully used the small thrusters on her suit to move along the hull. She followed Lee's instructions precisely, moving slowly toward the alien device. "I see it," she said after several minutes. The probe was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its surface was smooth and dark gray, with faint blue lines running across it like circuits. It had attached itself to the ship's hull, partially merged with the metal. "I'm approaching the probe now," Kim reported. "Good," Lee replied. "Move slowly. No sudden movements." Kim floated closer to the alien device. Up close, she could see it was pulsing slightly, the blue lines glowing and fading in a rhythm. "Attach the communication device to the flattest surface you can find," Lee instructed. Kim reached for the small device attached to her suit. Her hands trembled as she carefully placed it against the probe's surface. To her surprise, the device stuck easily, as if the probe had accepted it. "It's attached," she said. "Good. Now activate it using the sequence we programmed." Kim pressed the sequence on the small keypad. The device lit up, sending pulses of light in the pattern they had designed. A simple, non-threatening message based on the probe's own communication style. For several tense seconds, nothing happened. Then the probe's blue lines glowed brighter. The device on its surface pulsed in response. "It's working," Kim said excitedly. "It's responding to our message." The probe's surface rippled like water. The blue lines changed pattern, becoming more complex. "What's happening?" Kim asked, suddenly nervous again. Before Lee could answer, the probe released a bright pulse of blue light. Kim flinched, but the light wasn't harmful. Instead, it scanned her from head to toe. "It's scanning you," Lee said. "Stay calm. It's trying to understand." The scanning light faded. Then the probe began to change shape. Part of it separated from the main body, forming a small spherical object about the size of a baseball. "Lee, what's happening?" Kim asked, her voice tight with fear. "I think it's giving us something," Lee replied, sounding surprised. "A response to our message." The small sphere floated toward Kim. Instinctively, she reached out and took it. The sphere felt warm in her gloved hands, pulsing gently with blue light. "I have it," she said. "Now what?" "Come back to the ship," Lee instructed. "Use your thrusters to return to the airlock." As Kim began to move away, the main probe detached from the ship's hull. It floated free for a moment, then began to move away into space. "The probe is leaving," Kim reported. "It got what it came for," Lee said. "Information. And it left us something in return." Back inside the ship, scientists examined the alien sphere in a secure lab. It contained vast amounts of data: star charts, atmospheric readings from various planets, and what appeared to be simple greeting messages in mathematical code. "It's a gift," Lee explained to Captain Choi and the other officers. "A peaceful exchange of information. Our message worked. We convinced it we weren't a threat." The ship's systems had returned to normal. Repairs were underway, and the crisis was over. Later that day, Kim found Lee in the ship's medical bay, where doctors were treating his injuries properly. "How are you feeling?" she asked, standing awkwardly by his bed. "I'll live," he replied with a small smile. "You did well out there." Kim looked down at her hands. "I've been thinking a lot about how I treated you. All this time, I judged you without knowing anything about you." Lee watched her calmly, neither accepting nor dismissing her words. "I was wrong," Kim continued. "Not just about you, but about so many things. I brought old prejudices from Earth, the very things we were supposed to leave behind." "People don't change overnight," Lee said quietly. "Old ways of thinking are hard to break." "But they need to be broken," Kim insisted. "If we're going to build a new world, we need to be better than we were on Earth." Lee nodded. "That's why I took this job. New beginnings. No ranks, no past glories. Just the work in front of me." "I'd like to hear about your past someday," Kim said. "If you're willing to share it." Lee seemed surprised by this. "You would?" "Yes," Kim said sincerely. "I want to know the story of the man I misjudged so badly." A week later, the ship New Hope continued its journey toward their new home. Repairs were complete, and life returned to normal, or almost normal. In the ship's garden dome, Kim's son sat at a small table with Lee Jin. Between them was a chessboard. Around them, plants from Earth grew in carefully maintained conditions, preparing for life on a new world. "So after the Proxima incident, what happened to your team?" Kim asked. Lee moved a chess piece before answering. "We were reassigned. Earth government was nervous about further contact. They wanted military presence increased. And you disagreed." Lee nodded. "I believed we needed understanding, not weapons. That's partly why I retired." Kim considered her next move, both on the board and in conversation. "Do you think the aliens who created that probe are still out there, waiting for us?" "Perhaps," Lee said. "Or perhaps they left these automated systems behind long ago and moved on to something beyond our understanding." Kim moved her knight, capturing one of Lee's pawns. "Either way, we'll need to be better humans when we meet them." Lee smiled slightly. "Yes, we will." Above them, through the clear dome, stars shone brightly. Somewhere among them was Kepler 438 bits, their future home. And somewhere else, perhaps, were the beings who had created the probe, waiting to learn if humans were worthy of contact. The journey continued, and with it, the chance for humanity to learn, to grow, and to leave old prejudices behind among the stars.